Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom and Shavua Tov. As we now enter into the last week of this month of Nisan, at a time when we are all trying to come to grips with this new world that we are living in, a whole world that has defying all our assumptions about what the world is, and seems not to be offering us, as of now, any clear answers. But we will always be able to find answers in our holy Torah, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe used to teach. If you want to know what's happening in the news, then just turn to the weekly portion and look at the verses of the portion and the commentaries, and they will find guidance about what is happening in the world. And presently we shall turn indeed to the portion that we shall be reading this coming Shabbat, the double portion of Tatzriah and Metzorah. But before I do so, I'd like to discuss a little more this concept of this new world. Our sages in the Talmud said that there were three individuals who actually lived through three different worlds. One of them was Noah. Noah saw the world as it was before the flood. He experienced the world as it was during the flood, and he experienced the world after the flood. Likewise, Job saw three worlds. He saw the world as it was in his time of splendor and glory, as recounted in the first chapter of the book of Job. Then he saw the world devastated as he succumbed to these terrible illnesses with which he was afflicted. But then, as recounted at the end of the book, he saw a new world when his status and his health and it was restored, and he had children. And the third individual whom the Talmud states saw three worlds was Daniel. Daniel, who was brought up in the holy city of Jerusalem, was a member of the tribe of Judah, and knew the world of the first temple, but was then taken in exile to Babylon and saw the world of exile. But finally he saw a new world, the world restored, and that was when he, as recounted at the beginning of the book of Ezra, he was present for the inauguration of the second temple. Well, we have seen the worlds that we have seen, each and every one of us, or that we have been exposed to, each and every one according to God's plan for your neshama and for my neshama. We're now watching how over the past few weeks everything has ground to a terrible halt, literally across the world, an amazing situation the like of which has never been seen, although there have been many wars and many devastations. But thank God we do have our electricity, our internet, and we hopefully have what to eat, and the rest is up to God. Let us hope that we will be worthy of seeing a new world and a better world, a world where instead of the corona there will be the crown of glory that will be restored to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, with its rebuilding very soon. Well, in this new world that we are moving into, and nobody knows exactly where we're going, of course our holy Torah does give us all that we need to know. And before I continue into the discussion I'd like to have with you today, I'd like first of all just to help you to see some of the many resources which are available on the Azamra website, and I'm just going to show you on your screen now what some of the resources that are available to you on the Azamra website. So please let me just show you what we have here. If you look at the links at the top of the page, you will see the menus. You will see links to the weekly Torah calendar, which gives you a complete guide to what is happening this week on the spiritual plane, and coming events such as Rosh Chodesh and at the end of this week. All of that is on the section that deals with the Torah calendar, and we also have the study schedule, which gives you the weekly parasha, links to commentary on the parasha, announcements about our classes, and about the schedule of our daily Bible study, and other recommended links. If you go then to the Abraham's Tent section of the website, this is where you will find all the links to live and archived audio video classes. Abraham's Tent, which is the main page in this section, is where you can find all of the archived audio MP3s, archives of the various classes on different subjects, recordings of songs, stories, and other materials. You can also find our latest classes. It's all on the one page. If you will scroll down, you will find a tremendous assortment of resources. And if you want to join the live class, you simply click on the class link and you'll have a screen to enable you to watch what you are watching now or at some later stage. If we then go to the section of Torah spirituality, here you have many different links to a whole variety of resources on the Azamra website. Torah for the Nations, including a complete commentary on the 53 portions of the Torah. We have access to the Know Your Bible commentaries. We have articles specially for the entire world on spiritual growth, on health and healing, and these are our many resources. I'm going to be particularly today dealing with the resources on spiritual growth. And the teachings that I'm going to be speaking about today for attaining a clear head are actually contained in these links that you have on this page. 8 Ways to Make the World Happier is a very brief summary of things that would be helpful for all of us to follow. A clear head is really the gist of what I'll be talking about today, how to attain a clear mind and soul, to know where one has to go spiritually. The whole thing is elaborated greatly in my book Under the Table, which actually has detailed chapters on what I should be talking about today: meditation of sitting, the meditation on the breath, and other pathways of meditation and spiritual growth. All of these materials are drawn from the writings of Rabbi Nachman and other greats, and they're also available on through this link on Torah spirituality, and other links on related subjects are available in the resources on health and healing. And particularly this time, as I spoke about in recent classes, you do have, first of all, the concise guide to the Torah healing pathway, and also you have the greater length, deeper work with all the details, my work on the wings of the sun, traditional Jewish healing. So please, at this time when so many of us are confined to our homes and we are facing the prospect of greatly reduced livelihood, thank God all of the resources that you are seeing here are all entirely free. And indeed, all of the things that I should be talking about today, are actually involve either no expenses whatever to do, or extremely limited expenses. And for that reason, I think that this is the greatness of Torah spirituality, that most of it is entirely free except for the expenditure of some effort, some determination, and some attention, some of your time, but actual financial expense, very little. So I hope that you're with me. I need to make some adjustments to our audio here to give you a better listening experience. Now, I regret to say that it seems likely that you will have to listen today on one channel. I'm not quite sure what's happening with the audio here, but let us hope that you'll be able to hear and understand what I am saying. I have been trying to work on the issues with the reception, and I do hope that I'll be getting some responses from the support of Azamra website to try to improve your experience. But for the moment, let us go on with today's discussion. And indeed, as I said, if you want to find out what is behind the news, you need to look at the weekly portion. And we already started yesterday entering the subject of defilement and infection and contagion, and we shall be entering into that subject in even greater detail in the coming week's double portion of Tazria and Metzora. I must confess that when I was a boy and I used to go to our local synagogue on the Shabbat in the earlier Sabbaths of the year during the reading of Genesis and Exodus, one could pretty much follow the narrative. But as soon as you got into the book of Leviticus, the complexity of the various sacrifices in all their details, and then the rituals for inaugurating a sanctuary that has not been seen in the world for maybe some 3,000 years, were not exactly calculated to attract the attention of a young boy or a teenager, and most of the book of Leviticus was quite literally for me a closed book. And it was only in the years since I started returning to my roots in my late 20s and started studying that I realized you cannot escape from these subjects. And throughout the 40 or more years that I have been studying the Torah on a more or less regular basis, for most of that time I could never really see the relevance, particularly of these two portions of this coming week, Tazria and Metzora, that speak about the subject of leprosy. Well, the leprosy of the Bible, known as Tzoraat, and the lepra being called the Metzora, this disease of Tzoraat, or should one say a number of morbid conditions, this is not to be identified with what in the contemporary world we've come to think of as leprosy. One thinks of Dr. Albert Schweitzer and his years of caring for the lepers of Africa, who actually had terribly swollen limbs, which eventually would actually fall off or disintegrate. And the tragedy was that he himself ended up with the disease he had been caring for and treating for so many years. And many people imagine that this kind of leprosy that existed has more or less been wiped out, although this is factually not the case. There is here in Jerusalem a lepers colony for people who are suffering from this terrible condition, and there are in different places in the world many people. Well, we'd all been brought up in the Western countries to imagine that devastating, contagious viruses like the present were a thing of the past, and we've all been rudely awakened in the last few weeks, particularly with the latest reports that this virus possibly escaped from some kind of laboratory that was actually involved in cultivating viruses, and that perhaps they included in this cocktail of this new virus the HIV virus that causes the AIDS condition, God forbid. All of these are very, very unpleasant developments which we will have to be taking steps to deal with, all of us, in the uncertain future that stands before us. But let's actually, before we go into the subject of how social distancing and the avoidance of contagion is all to be found in our portions that we read yesterday, Shemini, and the portions we shall read next week, Tazria and Mitzorah. It's all in there, and let's consider how. Yesterday's portion of Shemini started off with the description of the inauguration of the sanctuary, picking up from where we left off before Pesach with the portion of Leviticus, Vayikra, and Tzav, both of which followed on directly from the end of Exodus that we read a few weeks back, that was dealing with the actual construction and erection of the sanctuary. And when it was all ready, that's when we come to Yom Hashmini, the 8th day, which was the 8th day after the 7-day count up to the 1st of Nisan, the last 7 days of the month of Adar of that year, the year after they had left Egypt, when they were putting up the sanctuary. And that is what the first part of yesterday's portion dealt with, and then dealt with the terrible tragedy of the incense that was brought by the two older sons of Aaron, the high priest, Nadav and Avihu, into the holy sanctuary without their having been instructed to do so, and their death at the hands of heaven, marring this day of celebration, the culmination of so many months of preparation and anticipation, and here was this dreadful tragedy. And indeed, it's noteworthy that many great successes and victories and positive developments in the history of Israel have been marred by tragedy. The expulsion from Spain in 1492 and the loss of untold thousands of our brothers and sisters to the Spanish Inquisition and their forced conversion to Christianity. That was the precursor of the return of the greatest rabbis of the generation to the land of Israel in the years that followed, because many of the outstanding sages of Spain who escaped and went to Turkey or to Greece found their way to Israel, to the city of Tzfat, where indeed the crown of Torah was restored to part of its former glory with the arrival of outstanding sages like Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, Ari, and Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and other outstanding sages. So we see how out of tragedy came a level of redemption. The same could be said of later persecutions, the persecutions in Europe of the 17th century, that the massacres across many parts of Eastern Europe that actually preceded the revelation of a new level of Torah in the form of Chassidut. So we can certainly hope that we see also that the Holocaust itself was the precursor of the reestablishment of a Jewish sovereign independent state. Questionable how independent Israel really is, but we are totally dependent on God, and God is our hope. And out of that disaster of the destructions of the Holocaust, that did arise the state of Israel after 2,000 years of prayers and entreaties by the people of Israel to be able to return to our land and establish our independent political structure. So let us hope that today also, with this unprecedented situation across the world, this will indeed be a precursor to a great spiritual awakening, which you and I are able to start right now. So let's consider, after the description of the inauguration of the sanctuary in yesterday's portion and the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the Torah then goes into a lengthy section dealing with the differences between the pure and impure species of animals, of birds, of fish, and other creatures. And the Torah recounts all of the distinguishing marks of those animals that are deemed kosher for Israelite consumption, as opposed to the lack of those characteristics in the animals that are forbidden for Israelite consumption. And those species that are forbidden are called tameh. And the word tameh in this sense means unclean, impure, and forbidden for Israelite consumption. But this sense of the term tameh used in yesterday's portion is not quite the same as the sense in which the same word tameh recurs in the later part of the portion. After the account of the various forbidden species, the animals, the fish, and the locusts, the Torah then comes into a section dealing with what happens if an unclean species of animal, one of them dies, and the cadaver itself possesses a quality known as tum'ah. A person who touches the cadaver of the animal becomes tameh, becomes pure in a way that cannot be defined exactly as in the sense of the unclean species of animal, tameh, because forbidden for consumption. The tum'ah, the impurity that comes from the touching of an unclean animal. And the same applies if a person touched the cadaver of a kosher species of animal that was not correctly slaughtered. There too, the contact with the flesh of the dead animal, even though it was a kosher species, if it was not properly slaughtered but died through either a stab wound or through suffocation or starvation or any other, through being subject to an attack by animals of prey, and if the animal died without shchita, the cadaver also confers a status of tameh, unclean or impure, to the person that touched it. And in this second sense of the word tameh, as in the later part of our portion yesterday, Shemini, there are a variety of different categories that cause a person to become tameh in this second sense. The word tameh in the second sense is a status where you may be able to see absolutely no physical difference in the person before they touch the cadaver or afterwards. You will see no physical change in them whatever. The same in various other categories that confer a status of tameh, of impurity. We had in the later part of yesterday's portion, after the commandment about the uncleanness of the cadaver of unclean species, the Torah then gave us a list of 8 little creatures, including mice and certain kinds of lizards and other creeping creatures, that if they die and even the tiniest piece of their cadaver comes in contact with a person or a vessel or with food, these pieces of these creatures, let alone if a dead mouse was found on some produce, or if a person had to touch the dead mouse or the dead lizard in the process of removing it, the person would become tameh with this ritual uncleanliness which cannot be seen, but the status of the person is such that in temple times he would not, or she, be allowed to go into the temple, not allowed to enter the temple precincts, and not allowed to consume any of the holy foods such as sacrificial meats, or if it was a priest, who'd not be allowed to eat his priestly terumah, food and drink. So the category of tameh in practical terms today has very little effect. There's very little significance for us in practical terms, with the exception of the fact that somebody who is in a state of tum'ah, a state of ritual impurity, until today is not allowed to enter the temple precincts on the Temple Mount. And indeed, those who do go up onto the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in order to enter the place where the temple once stood must, prior to ascending the Temple Mount, do the one thing that enables them to be freed from most kinds of ritual impurity, and that is to immerse in a mikveh of pure waters. The first direct mention of the mikveh that purifies from tum'ah, from impurity, is in yesterday's portion, towards the end of the portion, where it says that the impurity leaves the person after immersion from the mikveh. So, in all other respects in our practical lives today, for the majority of people, it makes no difference whether we are pure or impure, all the more so because there's one particular form of tum'ah, which is discussed in detail in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, in the portion of HaDaat. That particular form of tum'ah, known as tum'at met, the impurity that comes from a dead body, the body of a human. That kind of tum'ah cannot be removed from the person simply by immersing in a mikveh. In addition to that, and prior to the person's immersing in the mikveh, in the case of tumat met, the person would have to receive the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer, as described there in the book of Numbers, in the first section of the portion of HaDaat. And the impurity that comes from a dead body, if a person touches the body, or touches a garment that was in contact with the body, or touches a grave, or touches a person who touched a dead person, that tum'ah, the defilement from contact with the dead, is a quite different kind of tum'ah, and works in different ways from the other kinds of impurity, from the kinds of impurity that were mentioned in yesterday's portion, the portion of Shemini, speaking about a person having contact with a cadaver of an unclean animal, or even a clean animal if it was not properly slaughtered, coming into contact with one of the unclean creatures listed in that list of mice, lizards, and so on. If a person touches a dead spider or a dead bee or even a dead pigeon, which is a kosher species of bird, the person does not become unclean through that kind of contact. The rules of tum'ah, impurity, and tohara, the purification from that impurity, are very, very variegated, with a multitude of concepts, a multitude of categories, which the majority of even learned Jewish people today are largely unfamiliar, except in the broadest terms. A whole section of our Mishnah, the entire sixth order of the Mishnah, which is called Seder Taharot, the order of purifications, deals entirely with the subject of the different kinds of impurity and how we may be purified from them. Likewise, in the laws of Maimonides' code, the Mishnah Torah of Rambam, one of the 14 books of which the Yad Chazakah, the mighty arm of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, one entire book is devoted to the laws of purity and impurity. It's one of the thickest volumes of the 14 books of which this Torah code consists. So there is an enormous complexity of laws, and there is an extensive introduction by Maimonides to the Mishnah order of Taharot, dealing with the subject, since Maimonides also, besides the Mishneh Torah, also wrote an entire commentary on the Mishnah. So the concept of defilement from contact with the dead is different from the concept of defilement from contact with an animal cadaver or one of the 8 kinds of shiratzim, the 8 little unclean creatures. It's different from the concept of leprosy in the biblical sense in the coming week's portion of Tzora'at. It is different from the impurity of a woman who is menstruating, the impurity known as nidah. It's different from the impurity conferred by a woman who has a morbid flow of blood, not at the time of her menstruation. She is called a zava. There's another kind of impurity where a male has a morbid flow from his member, some kind of gonorrhea or the like, and a number of other categories of tum'ah. What they all have in common is precisely what the world has been jolted into being forced to come to terms with in the last 6 weeks, and that is social distancing. Social distancing right there in our portion yesterday, and all the more so in the 2 portions, the double portion, which we're reading this coming Shabbat, both of which speak mainly about the subject of tzora'at, of biblical leprosy, and a number of other forms of impurity, including the impurity of the menstruant woman, the impurity of the zav, the male with a morbid flow, or a woman with a morbid flow. And the thing that all of these kinds of impurity have in common is social distancing. Let's now focus on the subject of the tzora'at, the leprosy, which our 2 portions of next Shabbat deal with. The Aramaic word for tzora'at is segiru. Segiru is from the root, which we have in Hebrew also, of closing up, sagar. Segiru, the kind of tzora'at, what is called leprosy in many of our translations, which the next 2 portions deal with, tazria and metzoiro, where the second portion takes its name from the individual afflicted by leprosy, metzoiro. This category, which, as I've said in Aramaic, is called segiru, closing up, may be said to be called such for a couple of very evident reasons. The first is that the person suffering from this condition, the metzorah, has to be closed up, away, shut out from regular human society, precisely the social distancing that we are talking about today, to the point that in all of the laws dealing with this subject, there's a very simple rule that the metzorah, this person, is one that you have to keep 4 cubits away from, with a cubit being the distance between the tip of your middle finger and your elbow. Let's call that an average of 17 or 18 inches, perhaps. That means that 4 cubits distance from any metzorah is actually the 2 yards recommended social distancing today. But there are many more details of this which I will be going into presently. But let me first of all note that this term tzora'at, the generic term for translated into English so often as leprosy, itself, this term tzora'at covers a variety of different situations. Our portion of the first of the 2 portions, this coming Shabbat, tazria, opens not with a bad kind of impurity, but actually a very good kind of tum'ah, the tum'ah of the yoledet, the woman that has given birth. A woman that has given birth has, in almost all cases, given birth together with a flow of blood, and from the moment that the blood flows in the woman giving birth, whether she gives birth to a viable child or to an aborted embryo after the 40th day, in either situation, and hopefully it will be in good cases, a successful live birth, the woman herself enters into the category of tum'ah. The Yoledet, the woman who has given birth, has, as it set forth in the beginning of the first of next Shabbos' two portions, at the beginning of Tazria, she has different rules depending on whether it was a boy or a girl. And as you can see from the text in the beginning of the portion, until the conclusion of her period of impurity, she is not allowed to enter the temple or to eat sacrificial portions. And this is true of all of the different categories of impurity in the Torah. After that brief section about the woman that has given birth, that is when the Torah enters the subject of Tzora'at proper, and starts off with a depiction of various kinds of phenomenon on the skin of the person. Here we come to the second sense of the Aramaic term segiru. Segiru meaning closing off of the divine vitality that gives life and health. The marks described on the skin of a Matzoiro in our portion, each of these different marks with its different symptoms is essentially a withdrawal of vital energy from the skin and from the limb in question. And this means that there is a closing up of the divine soul in the person, and according to our sages, this is caused not by some virus that can hit the righteous and the unrighteous. The lesson that the Torah is teaching us in the whole section about the Metzorah is that the Metzorah is in this condition because of some moral flaw, some moral failing. The most widely known cause of Tzorat is because the Metzorah has been Motzi Ra. He has emitted and brought forth evil from his mouth. Motzi Ra, bringing forth evil speech, according to the Torah framework, is liable to cause these withdrawals of vitality, because just as the person through his speech has banished the divine presence, has slandered and has demeaned some other person or people or group of people, so too his soul is simply shut off from the vitalizing light of God, and this will manifest itself in some way on the person's skin. It could be a blotch of some very morbid white, where there's no ruddy or darker vital color in the skin, no blood. Everything has been sucked out, and all there is sort of a ghastly pallor on the surface of the skin, and one or other signs will render that either impure or questionable. If there's a growth of some white hairs and the blotch of white on the skin, the priest, who is in this case the spiritual doctor who has to give the diagnosis, the priest will rule if he sees the unseemly pallid blotch on the skin with either a couple of hairs or more that have no vitality, that have turned white, or it could be some little patch of seemingly bright live skin inside this mark of pallid white. According to the various rules, all enumerated in the Mishnah of the tractate of Nagaim, the tractate dealing with Metzorah, and also enumerated in great detail in Maimonides' Code, the Kohen, the priest, the doctor, will see this, and he will not give a prescription. He won't send the person to hospital. What he will do is to send the person into isolation and into quarantine. Here we have, way back thousands of years ago, the wisdom of the Torah was such that there are contagions that you have to keep well away from. And for that reason, as we see in the second of the two portions that we read next Shabbat, the portion of Metzorah, which actually gives the rules of what the person afflicted with this situation has to do and how he can get purified from it. The Metzorah has to sit aside from regular people. In the days when they lived in walled cities, he had to go outside the city. He could not live in Jerusalem. He had to go outside and be all alone in social isolation and in quarantine until the situation changed. Well, as we see from these two portions, the role of the Kohen was not a medical doctor, not a physician. The word physician applies to the physical, and tzora'at is a condition that requires a spiritual healer. And for that reason, the Kohen who is brought to see the person who suddenly has this manifestation on his skin. As I mentioned, there are other forms of tzora'at also. It could be where a part of the person's beard, if it's a male, has just fallen out, leaving a big a space devoid of hairs, or on the person's head at some place, some netek where the hairs have fallen out of the head or the beard. That could also be a sign of tzora'at. And under the same category as we see in the portion of Tazriah, the second of next Shabbos' two portions, there's also these conditions on beged, in fabrics made of wool or linen or leather, and also the tzora'at of houses, where on the stone walls of the houses of Israel there might appear these lurid green or these lurid red marks, and the person would have to come running to the priest and say, I see something that looks like a plague on the house. All of these different manifestations, they're all included under the category of tzora'at. And in all cases, the individual Israelite has to be seen and inspected by the Kohen, or the garment affected or the walls of the house affected have to be inspected. If the mark on the skin is not fully a leprous mark under the definition of the Torah, then the priest will have to quarantine the person for a week and come back and inspect him to see what's happened after a week. Has the mark expanded? Has there now developed the white hair that was not there beforehand? Is there a little explosion of seemingly healthy flesh within the mark that could actually be an indication of the leprous mark? It is the Kohen who has to inspect the mark at the beginning. The Kohen has to, if he quarantined the person, has to come back and inspect the mark thereafter. And only when the mark has gone away and the person comes back and says, look, it's disappeared, only then, if indeed it's all disappeared, can the Kohen give the ruling to go through the purification procedure described in the second of next Shabbos portions, a portion of Metzorah, dealing with bringing the two birds, the cedar wood, the scarlet thread, and the hyssop, as described there in the portion of Metzorah. And then the person would have to go through a whole week of complete purity and would have to finally immerse yet again in the mikveh and bring his sacrifice of atonement to the temple. Well, now, the Kohen then is not a physician. The Kohen is coming to give the person the diagnosis whether his mark falls into the category of those that render the person tameh or not, be it on his skin, on his beard, on his hair, on his clothes in the house. And then the person is basically left to themselves. There's no mention of any actual physical doctor in the whole of these two portions, because the whole process of healing has to start through the spiritual awakening that this person has to undergo during his period of isolation. That is the key to his entire healing. This certainly is a teaching that we must understand and internalize in order to get a perspective on what we are all going through now. So here the Metzorah, if it was his house, the house is locked up until the next visit of the Kohen to see whether it's grown, whether it's spread, whether the stones will have to be torn out, the house replastered, or actually pulled down if it doesn't go away. If it's a garment, it has to be shown to the priest to see whether the mark will have to be ripped out and a patch sewn in, or whether the whole garment will have to be burned, and with the person likewise. So why the Kohen? Kabbalistically, the Kohen in the tree of the Sfirot is identified with the right-hand attribute of chesed, of kindness. The priest is the very epitome of kindness. He does everything for others and nothing for himself. His whole service is to bring blessing into the world through the sacrifices which he brings in the temple, which require the utmost degree of concentration, all of the proper kavanot, the proper intentions, a very, very difficult series of rituals which required years of training. The Kohen has no life of his own. Of course, he has his livelihood, he has his truma, but he is the people's teacher, the one that has to go around to all of the households and the farms, and in the process of requesting his teruma livelihood, he is to teach the people the Torah. And if the priest is required now to come running to see the Metzorah, to inspect the nega, to inspect the plague, this could be because the priest has not done enough to teach people the Torah that would enable them to lead lives that would be virtuous enough not to require God's message of a plague. So the role of the Kohen, the man of kindness, the role of the Kohen is to give the person that is suffering from this a handle to enhance their own self-awareness and self-consciousness. That's completely different from the contemporary concept of illness and curing of contemporary medicine, where the doctor is not at all concerned with the person's moral status, and that's certainly a good thing and a proper thing and part of the Hippocratic Oath, but the fact that the doctor, in the overwhelming majority of cases, feels the need to refrain entirely from giving any suggestions to the person suffering, and this too often extends to the failure of the doctor even to offer any kind of advice in terms of proper nutrition and in terms of proper lifestyle. So the doctor is not the spiritual healer that people need, and indeed we are hardly at all today hearing any kind of recommendations from the moral point of view for what the world is to do next. But here's where the Torah comes in, because this concept of sending off the Metzorah to his moshav, to his sitting place outside of the city, corresponding to our self-quarantines and to our social distancing. And indeed, the Torah specifies that whether it is a Metzorah, or whether it is a woman that is menstruating, or whether that it is some other level of tum'ah, particularly in the cases of the Zav, the Zavah, the Metzorah, and the Yoledet, those four categories: the woman with the morbid flow, the woman who has given birth, the man with a morbid flow, the leper, and also the nidah. In all of these cases, it's not only direct physical contact with the person that confers tum'ah. It's enough for a little fleck of saliva from the metzorah, or the zav, or zava, or the nida, a little fleck of saliva lands on the other person's face or their hand, that person is rendered tameh through contact with these body liquids of the person that is tameh. There are halachot dealing with all of the body liquids, not only the urine and the blood and the sweat, but also what comes forth from the nose, what comes forth from the mouth, from the ears. We see that the Torah and the Sage of Israel have preceded all the contemporary wisdom about different forms of contagion. It's all found in these laws of Tumah and Tohara in our Holy Torah. The concept that not only that if the nida or the zav or the zava, they sat on a chair or they laid on a bed, somebody else who now sits on that chair or lies on that bed receives a level of tum'ah. They become a secondary carrier. If the vessel, the garment, or the plate, the spoon, or some other vessel of one of these categories now touches food, the food is rendered tameh. Now, in most cases, if we're not dealing with sacrificial foods and we're not dealing with trumah, it's actually permitted by the Torah for a Israel to eat food that has become ritually impure by one of the above forms of impurity. Again, the laws dealing with the impurity or purity of different kinds of foods are very, very variegated and complex, but as a simple rule of thumb, only if the food that is defiled is sacrificial food or terumah food, or one of the tithes that the Israelites used to bring to Jerusalem to eat in Jerusalem in a state of purity. But any food that is not in this category is actually not forbidden for consumption by regular people if they're not going to go into the temple, if they're not going to offer a sacrifice. However, in the times of the Second Temple, there was a group of people who chose to lead their lives in such a way that they would avoid all possible contagion through contact with people who were likely to be on one level or another tameh. And interestingly enough, this category of people who we now today are all having to begin to learn to live like them, this category of people who did everything possible to avoid contagion, they are known as the Pharisees. Today, the world has suddenly awoken to the life of the Pharisees. Why are they called Pharisees? Because the word Pharisee is a Latinized version of the Hebrew word parush. Parush, someone that is separated. The Parushim, of whom there is a wealth of information in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, the Parushim avoided contact with anybody who could possibly have some level of tum'ah. This led to one of the most tragic separations in the history of Israel between the Perushim, the rabbis who became known as the Pharisees, and the majority of people who were known as Am Ha'oretz. The Am Ha'oretz were people who certainly kept the Sabbath and they kept the main commandments of the Torah that everybody knows about, but these people were not cognizant of the finer details of the laws of purity and impurity. And for that reason, the Am Ha'oretz, the unlearned person, might not realize that if his wife was in her nida menstruation and she had her garment on her, and later on she took it off and he sat on the garment, this man, without being aware of it, has received the level of tumah, of having sat upon the garment or the seat or the bed of a menstruating woman. And in this case, the Perushim would want to have no close contact with such a person. They would avoid all kinds of physical contact and many rules regarding how the Perushim would interact with other people, the various kinds of distancing and separation from their utensils, from their foods, and many other aspects. So here again, what I'm saying is that we see an awesome precedent for what the world is learning today in the law about quarantining and social distancing. We see all the precedents in the Torah. My friends in Africa tell me that many people in Africa are very familiar with aspects of this code. For example, the concept that menstruating women would separate from their menfolk during the time of the menstrual flow and would use different furnitures and would not cook for their husbands, and the various other forms of separation. All of these are highly reminiscent of the code of the Torah. And certainly we are at liberty to use our minds to seek to make the connection between the kinds of quarantining and social distancing today and all of these ancient laws of Tumah and Tahorah. And again, just like the coronavirus is not visible except under scientific conditions, but laboratory conditions, but to most people going out into a crowded area, nobody can see what's flying around there in the air or sticking to surfaces, to damp surfaces, and so on and so forth. And likewise, Tum'ah. In many cases, the person might be quite unaware that they have received some level of tumah, and this might be totally invisible to them. However, for the spiritual life of the person, particularly one who does purify himself or herself, particularly one who does regularly immerse in the mikveh, although today we cannot purify from tum'at met, from the impurity through contact with the dead, from all other kinds of tumah, including the menstruating woman, it is possible to completely purify ourselves through immersion in the mikveh. And for people who do practice this regularly, they become aware of how contact with things that confer tum'ah will affect their states of minds, their moods, the innocence of their joy, as opposed to heaviness and depression and so on. So now here we have our Metzorah, the leper has been sent out, he's sitting there alone. Here is the key to the whole thing, sitting. And that's what I'm talking about today. We finally get to the goal of today's discussion, settling the mind. Because it's something we all need to do. The Torah says the leper sits alone. And we too must learn to sit alone. And today, many of us confined to our homes or limited spaces, many without work. Here is a completely free activity that requires only for you to sit. Now, I have discussed this practice in my book, The Turkey Prince, so-called, the Under the Table, and you can read all the instructions and guidelines for the practice of sitting in an abbreviated form in a clear head on the spiritual growth page of a Zamra website, and in full detail in the book Under the Table on how to get up. Under the Table has a complete section. You can have links to read all of the chapters online, and if you'll scroll down the main links page, you'll see the chapter called The Art of Sitting. And The Art of Sitting explains, and please go and read it there, because there won't be time today to discuss the whole thing. But this practice is something which I personally began to learn about before I returned to my Torah roots back in the the early 1970s. And in those days, there was a practice that was greatly popularized by the Beatles at the time called transcendental meditation. Transcendental meditation required you to take a session of about 20 minutes twice a day and sit yourself comfortably in a chair in such a way that your head is well aligned with your spine. You have support for your back and you're not going to collapse to one side either forward or backwards. And close your eyes and just focus on what they call the mantra. In the case of transcendental meditation, it was the genius project of an Indian guru who started telling people in the West that if they would just repeat his Hindu words in their minds for their 20 minutes twice a day, they would reach nirvana. The Beatles made it popular. I had a relative who told me to try it, and after I was initiated and received my Hindu mantra, it stuck in my throat or my mind. I couldn't stand it, and I went back. I said, "Look, I don't like this mantra." She said, "Well, if the guru gave you that mantra, that is yours." I said, "The whole practice is simple enough. I don't need you guys. All you have to do is to sit there quietly." And I graduated to the word shalom, and that became my first beloved mantra. Well, now there's another form of this meditation that does not even require a mantra, and that is that as you sit and as you relax, you just focus on your breathing. You try to let go of your breathing and just let yourself breathe in without trying to stop. Breathe out until all the air flows out, and you just focus on your breath, and it's completely free. You can do it for 5 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, as long as you like. And this is the key to the practice that Rabbi Nachman made famous and popularized under the Hebrew term hitbodedut. Hitbodedut comes from the Hebrew word bad, a single branch, and it's in the Torah in our coming week's portion, Tazrei Metzorah, where the Metzorah has to sit alone. He has to sit alone to get into this practice of making oneself alone, that is to say, alone and separate from the material world that pulls us down. We are creatures with a spirit and a soul and a body. The body has its needs for food, drink, air, shelter, clothing, and all the other needs of the body with ever greater sophistication. The soul is completely remarkable and indescribable. The two coexist, and once you start sitting, when we're running every day, running to work, transportation, commuting, shopping, and everything else, all the things many of us cannot do right now, you're just too busy to notice even what's going on in your mind. But when you start sitting, and this is something Rabbi Nachman wanted us to do every day for his hour, the golden hour. I call it the elastic hour. It could be for an hour of 15 minutes or an hour of 45 minutes or an hour of 75 minutes or longer, as long as you like. This is the workshop for all spiritual growth. The first step is settling the mind. This form of meditation is mentioned in the writings of the outstanding Mekubalim, the Kabbalists. It's mentioned in the Sha'arei Kedusha of the outstanding student of Arizal, of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria. His student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, wrote an introduction to Hitbodedut back in the 1500s, known as the Gates of Holiness, Sha'arei Kedusha, in which he speaks about the ideal time for this practice, and he says it is in the middle of the night when there's no one around you, and when you go into a state where you are completely still. And it's in that state of complete stillness, physically, mentally, and emotionally, that one can then meditate on the unity of God in all the ways that I'll be speaking about in the coming weeks, God willing. And this state, of course, is so elusive and so hard to achieve, because the moment you've tried doing it, you get drowsy or you get distracted. You suddenly remember you've got to get up and run and do that thing you were supposed to, and so many other things. The phone rings, which you forgot to turn off, your etc., etc., etc. Well, all this takes time. It takes time to practice until you start getting more of a handle on yourself, understanding the land, the landscape. This is a practice of settling the mind, and this indeed is what the Exodus is all about, the going out of Egypt. Egypt is the material world. Egypt is stress, tension, work, work, work. Moses went to Pharaoh, he said, let them get out for a day of rest. All I want is to take them out for a day of rest. Let's get out of the city, out of the town. The first thing they learned in the wilderness was Shabbat. What is Shabbat if not Shevet, sitting? On the Shabbat, the Torah writes in the portion of the manna, Exodus chapter 16, today is Shabbat. Every person sit in your place. Nobody go out on the Shabbat. But of course, we try and go out to the synagogue when we're allowed to get out of our homes. We try and go out within the boundaries of the Eruv and or the other limitations on our movement. But really, the Shabbat for most people is a completely unknown experience. The experience of Shevet, of sitting until the divine presence rests upon you, sitting with your friends and your family at the table in fellowship, in song and prayer, and the divine presence rests. That's Shabbos. That's when the mind and the soul are settled. So my friends, we see how many lessons directly for today come out specifically from these parashas, these portions that may seem so very distant. Here we are in the last week of the month of Nisan, of a year that will prove to be quite unforgettable to all of us. We shall all be remembering and thinking about this Pesach very much in time to come, and let us hope we will be watching it from a better vantage point. And the best possible vantage point from which we can view everything is the settled mind of one who is accustomed to idbodedut, which is itself the remedy for the actions of the Metzorah, that morbid, sick person mentioned in our portion from whom we need to maintain the greatest possible distance. So this coming Thursday night and Friday will be Rosh Chodesh, the new moon of the coming month of Iyar. And it's well known that the month of Iyar, which was the month between the exodus from Egypt and the receiving the Torah, is the time of healing, as implied in the name of the month Iyar, Aleph Yud Resh, Ani Hashem Rofecho, I Hashem am your healer. The portion that was said during the first month after the Exodus, the portion that we read on the seventh day of Pesach. Ani Hashem Rofecha, I Hashem am your healer. May God bring healing to each one of us, healing to you and to your dear ones, to your family, to your friends, to all who are suffering. To people who are suffering across the world, may God Almighty send true healing into the world, and let us be the ones to begin to draw the light of this healing at this very time we are going through now. My very dear friends, Shavua Tov Mvorach, a good and a blessed week. Chodesh Tov Mvorach, with Rosh Chodesh next Thursday night, Friday, and Shabbat, 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. Let it be Chodesh Tov Mvorach, a good and a blessed month. And with the help of God, I will be back here same time next Sunday, discussing now more about the content of our meditations as we get accustomed to the art of sitting, the art of Shevet, the art of Shabbat, the true Shabbat that we can draw into the days of the week. Shavua Tov Vorach, a good and a blessed week.